Okay, so let's try to make a little bit of sense of this. So we kind of understood the tools that the Fed uses or has available. And so let's walk through an example where the Federal Reserve is going to try to use those tools and what they would do. So let's say that the Federal Reserve is targeting this federal funds rate of 2%. So here's the quantity of reserves. And the price is the federal funds rate. So it's the market that banks can borrow reserves from other banks in. So we have the supply and demand. And right now the federal funds rate is at 2.5%, and the Fed is going to try to keep it there. So let's suppose that demand increases. Demand for federal funds in the federal funds market, loans from other banks, demand for reserves increases. So, perhaps it's payday. So it's May 1st, right? Payday in my General Electric example. So what's going to happen? Well, demand's going to increase. And so the Federal Reserve then needs to do something. Otherwise, the federal funds rate is going to increase to, let's say, 3.5%. So how does the Fed keep it fixed at 2.5%? Well, one option is increase the supply. So option one is demand increase. Well, I'll just increase supply to meet that extra demand and keep the interest rate, the federal funds rate, pegged at 2.5%. Increase supply. So how does the Fed increase supply? How do I give more reserves to the banking system? Is I'm going to hand banks cash or reserves, and they're going to give me something in return, the Treasury securities. So I'm going to buy Treasury securities in the, what we say, open market operation. So I'm going to buy Treasury securities from banks. When the Fed buys, it gives reserves to the banking system, and that's going to keep the interest rate pegged at 2.5%. Now, the other option that the Fed has is I could try to decrease demand to offset that. Right? So banks are coming to this market to try and get more funds for payday. So how could I undo that? Well, if I know that this happens, for example, every May 1st or every 1st of every month, I can be prepared and potentially, right? So I could say, well, I'm going to decrease demand. I have two options to do that. I'll call this A and B. I can change the interest I charge for reserves or pay on reserves. So if I want to decrease demand, I want to have banks holding more reserves. So remember, demand is I need reserves. So if banks hold more reserves, they're not going to have to go to the federal funds market in order to cover payday. They'll have enough reserves on hand, or more banks will. And so I'm going to increase the interest I pay on reserves. And that would then shift demand back to the left. When I increase interest on reserves, demand shifts left. That's this red line. This is option 2. The other tool at the Fed's disposal, if I don't change the interest I pay banks for reserves, they keep at the Fed, I can change the reserve requirements. Remember, one of the reasons banks go to the federal funds market is they have to keep 10% of deposits on hand as reserves and have reserves on top of that to cover all the transactions, like the transfers that happen on paydays. So if I change the reserve requirement, I can allow banks to have more reserves available, effectively decreasing demand. So if I decrease the reserve requirement, that's also going to decrease demand, right? So now you don't have to hold as many reserves on hand as part of the requirement. And so you will have more funds available to cover the transactions demand created by payday. So that's an effective shift to the left in the demand of reserves. So if the Fed gets that just right, then they have undone the effect of the increase in demand, and they've kept the interest rate pegged at 2.5%. So this takes a little practice. You just kind of have to go through and get used to what are the tools the Fed has and how do they work and which direction does it move demand or supply. And then I've got a question to practice some of that. So have a look at the question on Learning Objective 7 on Canvas. And once you complete that, we'll be on to Learning Objective 8, where we understand a little bit more about what the Fed is trying to accomplish with this interest rate target.